Jersey in the early part of the month. Before we get into the specifics of the findings, I think it's always helpful to level set on what we did with the research so that we're all on the same page about the methodology and all that good stuff. Certainly don't expect everybody to read all the small print on this page, but generally what we did with this poll was we fielded a mixed mode statewide representative sample that we augmented with a few oversamples. To Ed's point, we were able to oversample voters who live in the Delaware River watershed, and we were able to oversample voters who live in targeted legislative districts across the state, what are kind of just known as the swing legislative districts in those odd year elections, to just make sure that all of the estimates that we had on the top line were also stable in those key geographies where decision makers obviously are really interested and invested. And so we reached over 1,000 voters across the state with the base representative statewide base sample of 600 interviews, and then the oversamples in the watershed and in those targeted legislative districts. Just so we're on the same page, the legislative districts that we targeted are largely in South and Central Jersey, LDs 1, 2, 3, 8, 11 in Monmouth County, and then 16 Central Jersey, 25, 38 and 39 in the northern part of the state. We were in the field with this poll from October 1st to the 12th. We reached folks both with live telephone calls, many on cell phones, and with online surveys that we solicited using a text message and email invitations. The overall margin of error on a survey, that's 600 interviews, which is what we weighted the data to, is plus or minus 4%. Okay, so to the key takeaways. To Ed's point, I mean, I think to say anything other than this being a poll that just reveals broad support for conservation, it would be an understatement. In every measure, we see that New Jersey voters place a really high level of importance on open space, on outdoor recreation, that they see this moment of the pandemic as only a doubling down on that. And there's a number of kind of principles, values that underpin those assessments. And we'll get to some of those in a second. But there's because generally folks see conservation broadly as really important, there's like a lot of different specific conservation priorities that we also find to be tremendously important for folks. Really kind of across the board. There is a little bit of partisan polarization on some of these topics, but not as much as you might expect. Whether we talk about this stuff in the context of COVID or not, we generally find public opinion to be on the side of supporting these different conservation priorities. So that's an interesting takeaway, that the injecting COVID into the conversation doesn't really change the tenor of that conversation or the support that we're able to garner for some of these priorities. Also, to Ed's point, we found that in this trade-off proposition between making, austerity cuts to conservation priorities and making cuts to virtually anything else, we generally find very little appetite among New Jersey voters for cutting conservation, and that as we move folks through and reveal for them some of the consequences of what those cuts might entail, that we actually are able to peel away some folks even more than we have at the beginning of the survey, to rejecting further cut or any cuts to conservation. We also find on kind of the flip side of that coin that there's some openness to some different revenue solutions for injecting more money into clean water efforts. I'll get to the specifics of those in a second. And then we also are able to isolate a few of the kind of talking points or consequences again of what would happen if we don't make these investments, if we do make cuts. And we're able to kind of show that there are some things that would really bother and put folks on the wrong side of public opinion if these things were to happen. So again, we have some specifics of that. I hate to read bullet points, so we'll get to all the kind of good findings here and all the numbers in a second. So let's start with the kind of high level priorities and these principles. I think the principles are really interesting and important. And I'll just note pluses to Ed for being on message and talking about talking about these things in kind of these terms that are pretty values laden and with kind of a moral clarity, and talking about the next generation, talking about our kids and grandkids, we definitely found that that kind of language is really important. And so I'll just call Ed out for being a good communicator and taking lessons from this pool already in his intro. So let's start with just this baseline question. How important is open space to New Jersey voters? And we find it's very important, right? So we asked this question: would you say open spaces, parks, and outdoor recreation are very important, somewhat important, a little important, or not at all important to you? And we find that there's just very few voters in New Jersey who say they're either a little or not at all important, and that broad majorities are in what we call the top box, so the highest response on this question say that open spaces are very important to them. 61% of voters across the state, 61% in the Delaware River watershed, and 58% in our targeted legislative districts say very important. And then you've got 9 in 10 in either the top or the top two boxes, so either saying very or somewhat important. So it's like a universally held belief that open space, outdoor recreation, and parks is important to New Jersey voters. And then we asked this question as a follow-up: do you agree or disagree that due to social distancing guidelines and the closures of some indoor public spaces, the coronavirus pandemic has made open spaces, parks, and outdoor recreation even more important than ever? And that generally we see almost near universal agreement with that sentiment. 85% across the state, 83% in the watershed, and 84% in our targeted legislative districts agree with that sentiment. Again, strong majorities in the top box on this measure saying that they strongly agree with this notion that these spaces are more important than ever due to the unique circumstances surrounding the pandemic. Then when we get a little bit beneath the surface and we start to poke at what are the kind of core priorities specifically as it relates to conservation and the environment, this is sort of the what we would call our kind of top tier very important priorities. We tested a whole litany of different topics, and these are abbreviated from how we specifically tested them, just for clarity and to fit them on this slide. But we asked for each of these if each one is very important, somewhat important, a little important, or not at all important to you personally. And I'll just call out, kind of above and beyond everything else, we find that there's just almost universal unanimity behind this notion that protecting New Jersey's drinking water is very important. We find that 9 in 10 voters statewide, 93% in the watershed, and 88% in the target legislative districts say that protecting New Jersey's drinking water is very important. Everything else along in this slide is also impressive numbers. You're talking about top box numbers in the high 70s to low 70s to high 60s, all being really like, you're just talking about pretty consensus public opinion around the intensity of how important each of these things is, from preventing oil and gas pipeline accidents, cleaning up rivers and streams, protecting wildlife and natural areas, preserving productive farms, and developing clean energy sources, all just being like, just not a lot of controversy around these things being very important to most New Jersey voters. When you kind of combine the very important with somewhat important, there's just very few people who say this stuff is not important. When we look at these kind of top tier, priorities related to conservation and the environment, we do see a little bit of partisan contour, less so around around drinking water. There's not a huge difference between how Democrats and Republicans think about protecting drinking water. We do see Republicans and to a slightly lesser extent political independents be just a little softer in the kind of broad number that say these things are very important, particularly on developing clean energy sources, which is a little bit more of a kind of tribalized, partisan, polarized priority. But otherwise, preserving productive farms doesn't have much partisan contour. Protecting wildlife and natural areas, you're seeing, and cleaning up rivers and streams, preventing oil and gas pipeline accidents, you're seeing over 6 in 10 Republicans saying each of these is very important, and even more independents and Democrats saying that. This is our kind of second tier list of priorities. Again, we had this long list of priorities that we looked at in this research. And again, I would just note that particularly the 5 on the left side of this slide, These are still very strong numbers with when you have, a broad majority to over 6 and 10 to almost 2 and 3 on some of these voters saying each of these is very important. Again, that's the top box measure where we see real intensity. And so maintaining parks, trails, and recreation, protecting open space, reducing and preventing flooding, addressing climate change, funding the Department of Environmental Protection, the state's Department of Environmental Protection. Each of those we do see with a broad level of intensity, a little bit softer intensity around the new creation of parks, trails, and recreation areas. There's more popularity behind maintenance, interestingly. And then the one that kind of fell off a bit was this idea of investing in electrified transit, which I've posited to Ed and Kristen and Henry and team that we need that there's probably an education gap here on what investing in electrified transit actually means. And that maybe that language is a little bit less accessible to some voters. So that's a good lesson learned here. And it's just a little bit of a softer priority relative to the others. Moving on to this next slide, I will note that there is more partisan polarization on this second tier group of priorities, particularly around climate. And I'll just highlight that here in the middle. Also on funding the Department of Environmental Protection, you've got Republican partisans who are going to be less likely to support government programs and spending. But then, climate is just a tremendously polarized debate along partisan lines. That's certainly not unique to New Jersey. But it's important to recognize that this notion of addressing climate change is off the charts among Democrats and quite unpopular among Republicans. And among independents, it comes pretty close to where it is on the top line, with 6 and 10 independents saying that it's very important. There's some level of partisan polarization on some of these other topics. Again, funding the Department of Environmental Protection, but otherwise, it's relatively flat, particularly compared to climate, where there's just this massive gulf. You're talking about 70 points between Democrats and Republicans on that topic specifically. So in this next exercise, this is sort of these kind of principles that we looked at. And we asked folks to generally tell us if they agree or disagree with each of these statements. But the way we were trying to tease this out, and again, to Ed's point at the top, we really wanted to understand how does COVID impact this general priority set, if it impacts it at all. And again, we generally find that most folks agree that now it's more important than ever, given COVID, to make sure that we're investing in open space and parks and outdoor recreation. But what we did was we did this kind of little mini experiment inside the survey where we asked half of the sample about these statements. And again, we just asked them if they agree or disagree with each of these statements on the left, and none of them mentioned COVID at all. And then we modified each of them to include a bit about COVID. And we randomly asked the other half of the sample to say if they agree or disagree with those on the right. So for example, we said the second statement down, protecting water quality and land in New Jersey is critical to keeping the state's economy strong, was how half of the sample heard this question. The other half heard it as protecting water quality and land in New Jersey is critical to keeping the state's economy strong, even in a time of COVID. So we wanted to understand does injecting COVID change attitudes about these principles? And then also just which of these principles is most broadly held? Which of these attitudes really kind of do New Jersey voters anchor into? And so we've got a number of them. I just want to go through them really quick because we abbreviate them on the following slides. But we've got this notion of even when the state budget is tight, we should still find the money to invest in protecting New Jersey's land, water, and wildlife. And of course, the modifier there for COVID is even when the state budget is tight in a time of COVID. I already read you the second one. The third one down, we have a moral obligation to take care of our natural environment. Again, even in a time of COVID, we have a moral obligation. We need to take care of our natural environment for the sake of our children and grandchildren. And then it is more important than ever to have parks, preserves, and other public spaces where we can safely enjoy the outdoors. And so I'll just note, there's basically no difference on almost any of these between the COVID framing and the non-COVID framing around these general principles. And what we find is nearly 9 in 10 New Jersey voters agree with each of these. So these are not at all divisive. These are not at all polarizing, really type principles. These are the kinds of statements that most New Jersey voters willingly glom onto and just generally at gut level think are all true. This is the percent of voters who agree in total. I do want to call out though where we see more intensity. So this slide is now showing some of these statements, but the percent that strongly agree as opposed to just agree in total. And what we find is the two on the left here are, the two that I would argue are sort of the most grounded in core values and this kind of morality and this generally kind of high-minded rhetoric around a moral obligation to take care of our natural environment and taking care of our natural environment for the sake of our children and grandchildren. Again, hat tip to Ed for incorporating this language in his intro, because this is the kind of stuff that's really helpful, right? This is the kind of stuff that 7 in 10 New Jersey voters strongly agree with. So really the intensity off the charts with these, but again, no difference in this kind of values framing, whether we talk about it in the context of COVID or not. We do see a bit of a difference on the COVID messaging when we talk about protecting water and land. And we see more intensity behind COVID, the kind of specific COVID framing on that particular principle when we do talk about COVID, but it's only by 8 points and it's not. And when we look at the total agree, it's not a very big difference. It's actually identical, but 87% agree in total, regardless of or whether we talk about it in the COVID frame or not. We do see this intensity differential though, where we're talking about it with COVID makes more sense. And I'll just note, what I've been kind of advising my clients this year is just like, it might, don't overthink it when it comes to COVID, right? COVID is what everybody's talking about. It's what everybody's thinking about. It is the issue of the day. And so if you're speaking about it on people's, on their terms, you're talking their language and you're being salient to the moment. And so these results to me say it's really safe to talk about things in the context of COVID, and we should, because that's what's salient for folks these days. And that can be a way that we can really capture their attention. But generally we want to keep things really grounded in these kind of values laden frames, talking about family, talking about children and grandchildren, and the moral obligation that we have to them to take care of our natural environment. A little softer on these other top tier statements, the notion that it's more important than ever to take care of parks and other public spaces. And then it's a little softer in terms of the intensity of agreement when we talk about the state budget, where again, you have 86%, 85% agreeing in total, but only about half saying that they strongly agree with this notion of, even when the state budget's tight, we should still find the money to invest in protecting Pennsylvania's land, water, and wildlife. We're connecting on a little bit more of an emotional level, I believe, if we're talking in this context. Okay, so just a quick hit here. This is, when you have topics like this that are reaching, 9 in 10, 8 in 10 on the top line in terms of total agreement, that usually means that you're not going to see much partisan polarization, and that's certainly the case here. These are some of the few topics that you see where there's not a big difference between Democrats and Republicans. 88% of Republicans say that we need to do this for our kids and grandchildren. 85% of self-identified Republicans say we have a moral obligation to take care of the environment. These are really kind of cross-partisan frames that we can take out of the typically bitter polarized environment that we're sitting in today, particularly around things like climate, as I talked about a minute ago. Okay, so moving on to the conversation around the money, which was always super important, particularly in New Jersey, when folks are always tax sensitive and always kind of fiscally sensitive because of the pretty big property tax burden that they typically face. So we always know that there's fiscal sensitivity in New Jersey. So entering into this conversation, that's really important background to keep in mind. These findings are tremendously encouraging. I don't want to bury the lead. So we looked at these different statements asking folks about priorities as it relates to state government investment as part of this economic recovery that Ed talked about at the top. And we asked both statements that are specific to conservation and some that are not specific to conservation as sort of controls. And what we found was like broad levels of support for each of these, maybe like a little bit more support for jobs and for small business grants directly, as opposed to direct payments to the unemployed, but really, really, really strong support for this idea of investing in water infrastructure. And again, like these are the kinds of findings where you're talking about 90%, 89%, 82% statewide, 91% in the watershed, 86% in our targeted legislative districts. There's just no marketplace to be against these ideas for as we think about moving into an economic recovery, what state government should be investing in. Just broad levels of agreement that we should be doing each of these things. There is a little bit of partisan polarization on the more, on three of these topics specifically, on environmental protection that provides good local jobs, on water infrastructure investments, and on direct payments to the unemployed. The 30-point gap there between Democrats and Republicans. Markedly less partisan polarization around grants for small businesses, where both Democrats and Republicans are nearly equal in their level of strong support. That's what we're showing here is the intensity measure. And so you see softer, strong support around environmental protection that provides good local jobs and around investments in water infrastructure, but you do still see 42% of Republicans saying they strongly support investments in water infrastructure. Okay, so this is we've mentioned this a couple times at this point, but this is really kind of what we think of as our independent variable in this survey, which is where do folks come down when we force this, which is admittedly a false choice between cuts to conservation and cuts to everything else. Obviously, the state budget's far more complicated than that, but what we wanted to do was, in essence, get folks thinking in this paradigm of this choice. We had, in the context of limited resources and pinched budgets, specifically, we framed it as New Jersey facing a multi-billion-dollar budget shortfall, necessitating cuts. Would you prefer state government cut other items in the budget or make large cuts to conservation and environmental protection priorities? And what you find is that 6 in 10 voters prefer cuts to other items in the budget, and just 13% support cuts to conservation. We do have another 28% saying they don't know, or they refuse to answer, or they just, or both, or we should cut neither. So there's a fair amount of folks, kind of 3 in 10, kind of sitting out there somewhere in the middle. But by an overwhelming margin, folks prefer cuts to other things than conservation. And we see real intensity behind this. 38% say they strongly support cuts to other items in the budget. That's, basically three times as many strongly support other cuts to other items than support cuts to conservation in total. So you're just, again, the way I like to think of this is there's very little marketplace in the state for cutting conservation at this point in time. We kind of see beneath the surface that while there's a little bit of partisan polarization on this topic, it's not as much as you might imagine. Just 1 in 4 Republicans support conservation cuts. A majority, 52% of Republicans, support other cuts or cuts to other items in the budget. Just not a huge gap between Democrats, Independents, and Republicans on this. We don't see much contour on key demographics. Voters of color, Anglo voters are pretty similar in their support, or I should say their opposition to cuts to conservation, as are men and women. There's just not a huge variation across the board on this particular question. Same thing when we look at different parts of the state. I will note, interestingly, that we're most likely to see the rejection of cuts to conservation in more rural communities. 67% of voters who live in rural census blocks say that they prefer cuts to other items in the budget. But again, it's relatively stable. You're talking about, just about 6 in 10, maybe a little bit more than 6 in 10 in the rural areas, saying that they, reject this idea of cuts to conservation, and just only about 1 in 10 just across the state. So what does that mean in terms of where the kind of the opposite direction? Where are there opportunities to actually raise revenue, particularly in the context of improving water quality in rivers, streams, and lakes? And so we asked about a kind of number of different proposals, and I'll walk you through these different kind of themes that we saw. And generally, we saw some opportunities for revenue to support clean water in a couple of different areas. So first, we looked at bottled beverages. And we did a couple different things here. We tried to tease out both language around the idea of ending sales tax exemptions or making bottled beverage products subject to the same sales tax. And generally what we find is this language around ending sales tax exemptions being a little bit more broadly popular. You see 66% support ending the state sales tax exemption for bottled water, and that 63% support ending the state sales tax exemption for bottled tea and coffee, and using that revenue to improve water quality. A little bit softer support around making bottled water subject to the same 6% sales tax as other items, and 58% support making bottled tea and coffee subject to the same 6% sales tax. So this exemptions language, I think, is probably a little bit more preferable as you think about advocating for such a policy. I think the idea of like closing a loophole is always something folks glom onto in the research that I've done, and this idea of ending an exemption kind of tacks to that in some ways. And I'll also note that we did some similar research in Pennsylvania on topics similar to this, and we found a similar finding that this notion of ending exemptions is a little bit more popular than expanding a sales tax. And so I just encourage folks to think about using that language. Some of the revenue raisers that are a little less popular is this idea of a $10 tax increase to conserve land, water, and wildlife. Not tremendously unpopular by any stretch, but just a little softer. 56% support raising taxes by $10 a year and using the money to conserve land, water, and wildlife. And then 52% supporting a $10 tax increase to improve water quality. When we talk about it as $20, it gets a little bit softer, not a huge difference here, but a little bit more opposition on both of those formulations when we raise that threshold to $20. And I'm always a little surprised when I find that there's not more folks who are willing to fork over 10 or $20. But again, you're talking about New Jersey, which is, could be the single most tax sensitive state in the country in the work that I've done. I did a poll earlier this year in a county that I won't name, where one of the people on the call was, before we did the poll, said, of course, coronavirus will be the top issue. And I said, I'll bet you $5 it's taxes. And it came back, and this was probably a month ago we did the poll, 30% taxes, like 13% coronavirus, right? So it's just like, it's New Jersey, it's always taxes. And so if you're ever finding people being supportive of tax increases, you're onto something. And so these aren't terrible numbers. I would like them to be higher, but they're not in the context of New Jersey, it's not that surprising. And again, there's huge amounts of partisan polarization on this $20 tax increase. Republicans are generally against it. Democrats are generally for it. Independents are pretty split down the middle, regardless of how we talk about it, whether it's money to conserve land, water, and wildlife, or money to improve water quality. Some of the other revenue raisers that we looked at, increasing the current statewide sales tax by 1/4 of 1 cent. To improve water quality, 52% support that, 43% oppose it, so pretty evenly divided, but leaning towards support. Increasing the fees for putting household garbage in landfills to improve water quality, an 11-point margin between support and opposition, with a bare majority, 50% saying they support it. And then borrowing money at low interest rates to improve water quality, 50% support that, 38% oppose that. Looking at this beneath the surface a little bit, I don't want to kill folks. I imagine that Kristen will, I don't know, Kristen, are we going to be able to share this deck with folks after the?
Sure, yep.
Awesome. So yeah, I don't want to spend too much time here getting into the weeds, but just some subgroup analysis here. Again, Republicans tend to be the least supportive of these revenue raisers. Democrats are the most on side, about 7 in 10 Democrats on each of these. You've got women being a little bit more likely than men kind of across the board, voters of color being more likely than white voters, and Not a huge divide between college-educated voters and non-college voters on each of these. Our most popular revenue raisers I'm showing on this screen here. Two things in particular. One, dedicating existing sales tax revenue generated from sales of hunting, fishing, wildlife watching, and outdoor recreational equipment to improve water quality. On our internal call about this, we talked about this being broadly popular. I don't know how much revenue is actually available and that this would generate, but it's very much low-hanging fruit that almost everybody supports, right? 75% support it, 45% strongly support this idea, just 18% oppose it in total. And then with marijuana legalization on the ballot in New Jersey this year, we also asked about the idea of legalizing and taxing recreational marijuana to improve water quality. 67% support that, 52% strongly support it. Again, unclear to me exactly what the levers are for directing any cannabis tax receipts to water quality. But I do think, like from everything I've seen, I think it's quite likely that the ballot measure passes and that is a new stream of funding that comes in to the state as those marketplaces get set up for recreational cannabis in the state. You see here on these two that are net popular, you have Republican support, right? Almost universal support for among Democrats on these two. 86% of Democrats support dedicating recreation sales taxes to improving water quality. 82% of Democrats support legalizing and taxing recreational marijuana to improve water quality, but 50% of Republicans do the same on legal weed, and 59% of Republicans support dedicating recreational sales tax revenues to water quality. And then just really broad levels of support among political independents, those in the middle, a 54-point spread among independents on outdoor rec, and a 34-point spread on marijuana. So moving past specific, the opportunities for revenue, we asked that question a few slides ago about, make your pick. Do we cut environmental protection? Do we cut those priorities, or do we cut anything else? The way we structured the survey was we asked that question, and then we read them this battery of potential outcomes that are likely to happen if New Jersey makes large cuts to the state budget for conservation and environmental protection priorities. And we asked if each of these outcomes would be very concerning, somewhat concerning, a little concerning, or not at all concerning to the respondent. And what we're showing here is, some of these specific priorities or concerns that are kind of specific to the kind of loss of outdoor, loss of green space, of open space, of outdoor spaces. And we find that this idea of losing these spaces to development is sort of the most concerning across this kind of type of topic, that we'll see thousands of acres of natural and scenic places lost to development. 59% say they're very concerned about that. And then similar percentages, just above 50, saying that parks across the state will be neglected and fall into a state of disrepair. We'll move on to the next one. We also see the kind of economic impact being of concern to folks. Again, just around 50%, 52% on the one on the left, and 47% the one on the right. This is a split sample experiment again, talking about the sort of economic impacts, the jobs that will be lost in outdoor recreation if we don't invest, or if we make big draconian cuts. Not a big difference here. I will say that mentioning that this is one of the only thriving industries during the pandemic does make it a little bit more concerning to folks that we would make these cuts by a few points on the margin. It's not anything that's massive, but it would be advisable to make sure folks understand that, this is one of the few things that's actually continuing to create jobs and generate economic activity in the midst of this pandemic, and it would be foolish to undermine that at the height of a pandemic. Similar findings, I'll say a little bit softer in the total number of concerning when we look at how cuts would impact investments in clean renewable forms of energy. Again, this is This is really because Republicans tend to slough off a little bit when we start to talk about renewable energy. It's a more polarizing type issue, and so we see a little bit more softness in the total concern. But again, right around 50%, 49 and 48%, saying they're very concerned we'll lose opportunities to invest in good local jobs in the clean energy environment, or that we'll lose opportunities to invest in clean renewable forms of energy on the other side of the split. Here are a couple that kind of really popped in this survey. The two on the left is sort of like some of the scarier stuff, right? Some of the things that could happen, the really bad outcomes that could happen if we don't, to public health in particular, if we make these big cuts. And so one is that New Jersey will continue to have one of the worst air quality ratings in the nation. 64% say they're very concerned about that. And then another, that the state Department of Environmental Protection will lose its ability to regulate corporate polluters, resulting in less enforcement of clean air and water standards and increased danger of chemical and oil spills. So some really scary stuff there. 60% saying they're very concerned about that. That will lose funding for safety and oversight over fracking oil and gas pipelines, petrochemical facilities. 53% very concerned about that. And then we'll take a step backwards when it comes to mitigating and reversing climate change, a little bit softer on that one, 49% very concerning, 71% in total. I think there's real power in the facts here, right, around this one on the left, that will continue to have one of the worst air quality ratings in the nation. My guess is most regular voters don't know that that's the case to begin with, and that by introducing that information here, we see a real amount, or a real reaction, and that we see a lot of folks anchor into this concern when we raise it for them. And so I think that's an important takeaway here. You've got to make sure folks know that we have pretty bad air quality as it stands, and if we see cuts, it's only going to get worse. So I mentioned a minute ago, this was our kind of independent variable in our survey. We measured this question twice. This is, again, what would you prefer to cut? Conservation and the environment, or anything else? And at the beginning of the poll, we found just 13% would cut conservation, 59% would cut other items in the budget. At the end of the poll, after we had introduced all of these consequences to those cuts that I just talked to you about a second ago, we find that 66% say they would cut other items in the budget, just 12% would make large cuts to conservation. We find, interestingly, that there's a pattern here in who's responsive and who kind of moves off of cuts to conservation and into cuts to anything else. And it just tends to be more conservative audiences. It tends to be folks who are a little bit more downscale, of less education, white men, Republicans specifically, Central and South Jersey specifically. We find that those are the folks who are the most likely to move towards preferring budget cuts to other items over conservation. So again, to tie this all together, there's kind of consensus, overwhelming view that conservation and the environment are important, that there's a number of priorities that folks care deeply about, that they are grounded in these kind of fundamental values around morality and leaving something for our kids and our grandkids and future generations, that there's not a huge appetite. There's not really an appetite at all for cutting conservation priorities in the budget, and that instead folks are open to a number of potential revenue solutions for putting more money into conservation. That we've got some real good fodder for freaking people out around what the consequences of those cuts would be, particularly as it relates to dirty air, dirty water, the State Department of Environmental Protection losing its ability to regulate corporate polluters who people see as bad actors, and losing spaces, open spaces to development. That's another one I'd say that I've done a fair amount of research in like central New Jersey, where I've seen concerns about overdevelopment and the strain that overdevelopment puts on communities as it relates to traffic, as it relates to the loss of open space, as it relates to education, being a big concern for folks in some of the more densely populated. Obviously, it's New Jersey; it's the most densely populated state in the country. But it's but particularly in those spaces, like the idea of losing even more open space to development is a big concern. And then we see that there's an opportunity to even grow our base of support to some more conservative audiences, to some men and white men in particular, and more conservative Republican leaning voters when they learn about those consequences. So with that, well, I think we'll open it up to any discussion or questions that folks have about the research. Sip of water. Clean water.
Then I had gotten a question a little bit more in the beginning when you had split out some of the findings by like statewide versus the watershed versus our targeted districts. What would you say, you're wondering like where Delaware River respondents have stronger feelings? Is that sort of evidence of doing a good job engaging constituents in that area? What do you think sort of might be the
Kristen, I think like to me the big takeaway on the findings in the watershed is just how stable they are compared to the rest of the state. That like we're not seeing a huge difference on any of these things. I'll say like the idea that I'm gonna go back a few slides here. This one I thought was interesting, right? I mean, we see the watershed slightly, broader than the rest of the state. Just 2 points, but I think the fact that the rural communities are rejecting, the less populated parts of the state are rejecting cuts to conservation more than the more populated, more densely populated parts of the state. I think that's really interesting. But in general, what we found was like if you look at the top lines, we put the watershed numbers in the top lines, and there's just like very, very little difference between the watershed and the overall statewide opinions, just on basically every topic that we looked at. And basically every topic that we looked at was, as we've talked about, pretty good news from the perspective of an advocate for the environment in New Jersey. So yeah, I don't know. There's the difference between the watershed and the rest of the state is pretty minimal.
Thanks.
Just to follow up with that, Ben, I'm just wondering, you had a slide that had the breakdown of who doesn't care as much, and basically more conservative, white male. I'm just wondering if you dig down, combining this one sort of urban areas, communities of color, is there any kind of information on that you can derive of how much they care?
Well, yeah, I mean, so yeah, I'll go back to this one. Again, I think what's kind of interesting about this research is like the trends beneath the surface are generally pretty stable regardless of place type and regardless of demographic, and that the really key dividing lines tend to be partisan more than anything else, Patty. And so like we see, to the extent that, communities of color tend to be more democratic, you'd certainly expect to see more support for our issues in communities of color. And then I think like you've also got some specific communities that are more geographically focused, your Newarks, where you've had a more acute impact on water quality because of the nature of the terrible infrastructure and the fact that people were being poisoned in their water, and that crisis, and that being a big part of the conversation in the state over the course of the last, year, 18 months. So I do think like there's in the kind of more urban core in the north, there's probably some more resonance to some of our issues. But again, I think like to me, what's interesting about this body of research is like, it's pretty applicable to everybody, right? When you see numbers that are so broad, like what we're seeing in this research, it's hard to really call out one group here or there that feels much differently, except on some of those more kind of like loaded political topics like climate, where you've got a clear kind of like, my team says I'm not supposed to be for this, my team says I am supposed to be for this, and that's why I am, right? And that's pretty common these days, unfortunately. And it's something that advocates should take, shouldn't take with a grain of salt. I mean, like climate in particular, like that is political, like it just is. And it's frustrating, but it's important to recognize, right? That like, if we're talking about mitigating climate change, we're probably turning off a lot of Republicans because they're thinking about it through the context of politics, but we're also at the same time probably ginning up a lot of progressives and getting them really excited. So it's like, it's a double-edged sword, particularly as it relates to climate.
Thank you.
If folks have any other questions, you can either unmute yourself or drop them in the chat.
I just had a quick question, Ben. Were you using 95% confidence interval or 99?
The margin of error is plus or minus 4% and 95% confidence interval.
Okay.
For the statewide numbers. So it's a little bit higher for the subgroups.
Okay.
I just wanted to make one point, which is conservation funding is supported, it seems, by the public pretty widely. Unfortunately, it hasn't really transferred over to the New Jersey legislature and the governor because, you know, we saw a 15% cut to DEP last year in the budget that just finished up. We saw a $20 million reduction in lead investments from 80 down to 60. And we saw more raids on the Clean Energy Fund of $40 million on the 80 million they were already taking to 120 million. So I think there's some work which I'd like to discuss with folks about, you know, how to bridge the gap between the public and the lawmakers that are making up the very next budget to get it more aligned with what we want to see long-term in the state to protect these resources. And as they say in the poll, from development, the land being gobbled up and never again able to be available for nature. So that's, I think, everyone's homework.
Yep. Michelle asked a question in the chat. What would you say is the top messaging to talk with media and ultimately the public? I think Ed just did a good job at the top of his last comment, talking about how it's very clear that New Jersey voters prioritize funding conservation, right? First and foremost, that's a top talking point. Like, it's almost universally seen as really important to New Jersey voters, and they don't want to see cuts to it. So I think that's one really key talking point. I think to the extent that, you know, you get like the next breath, Michelle, it's like grounding that in, I mean, obviously sometimes you only get one breath, you only get one sentence, right? So like that's the key bullet point, right? I would say like the next one is, and why is that? Well, it's because New Jersey voters see that we have a moral obligation to protect things for the next generation and to protect this land and to protect our air and our water from pollution, from development, so that our kids and our grandkids can have a clean New Jersey and beautiful places to enjoy and clean water to drink and clean air to breathe. And so really kind of grounding it in those values. I think those, if there's two public facing talking points to take away from this research, that's the two.
And folks should know that we are going to be working to translate these findings into some talking points, and then a kit to share them further on social media, beyond the really detailed homework that Ed laid out for sure, into translating it. But in terms of public communications, we'll be working on that. We'll also be working jointly with our allies in Pennsylvania on the other side. And I think the data, the results show that I think we feel pretty comfortable using pretty much all the same messaging and throughout. There was a lot more similarities and differences, but we'll make sure we dig into that.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that I really think that while we can't drill down too deeply on urban, you say it's across the board, urban, suburban, and rural, there's a lot of myth about conservation just being caring people, white people in the suburbs or rural care about conservation, and people in cities don't care as much. And that's a myth. It's a false narrative that this really shows everybody cares. So I think as a talking point, it's whether you live in a city, a suburb, or rural, all of New Jersey cares about this, and really helping connect the dots on all the different kinds of people in New Jersey, I think would be helpful.
And I think Patty, a really good nexus to get across all of the different types of communities, right? Is like, no matter where you live in New Jersey, you want to have access to clean water, right? Everybody. And obviously there are some communities, particularly in urban communities, that are disproportionately impacted by lack of investment in water infrastructure and clean water infrastructure. And that's like in and of itself an injustice that needs to be remedied. So I think like there's different ways you could think about talking about it in different parts of the state, but I think the universality of the concern is the talking point to your point, Betty.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. We really appreciate you being here today, and we will be following up with the definitely the poll and memo and then talking points very soon. Thanks everyone.
Have a good one.